You do it on a separate piece of paper. All right, this is Mr. Ng going over the Precalculus Chapter 4B test, taken on April 5th, 2019. This is version B. Question number 1 says, find the amplitude of y equals 1 minus 6 cosine, parentheses 3x minus pi. Now, in this problem, I like to do is make sure that I write the letters above it. So I have here d, so that's the constant. So sometimes they'll have it over here in the far right. You can move the front. Your a value is in front of the trig function, cosine b. B is after the trig function, but before the parentheses, and then x minus c. The amplitude is equal to the absolute value of your a value. So my a value is right here. So my a value is actually negative 6. And if you take the absolute value of negative 6 is 6. So my answer is 6. And 6 is not on here. That's why your answer is J, none of the above. Question number 2 says, solve y equals arc sine 1/2. Remember, arc is the same thing as the inverse. So the inverse of sine of 1/2. Basically what that means is for you to switch them. Draw those arrows, very helpful. So I have sine of y equals 1/2. So the question is, sine of an angle equals positive 1/2. So I need to find positive 1/2. Or where is sine positive? Sine is positive in these two quadrants because it says all students take calculus, all trig functions are positive here. Sine and its reciprocal cosecant are positive, everything else is negative. My two locations for 1/2, if you use my counting technique, that's 1, 2, 3, and then you can make it over 2, and then the radicals. And remember, it goes cosine sine. So sine is 1/2 here at pi over 6. And then if you do your counting technique on this side, that would be 1, 2, 3. And remember, sine is the second one, so this would be 1/2 here at 5 pi over 6. So you have two answers, pi over 6 and 5 pi over 6. Now, one thing you should have had written down is the restrictions of the domain of the inverse trig functions, or basically in some ways we call it the new range. For inverse of sine is between negative pi over 2 and pi over 2. To get a common denominator, multiplied by 3 over 3. 3 over 3, that gives you negative 3 pi over 6 and 3 pi over 6. That means if you think of like a number line, 1 pi over 6 is like right here. So that matches it. 5 pi over 6 is way out here, so that's outside, so you reject this one. That means your only answer is pi over 6, which is choice D. As you saw, I put into Aries the 4 different versions, and the reason why I did that is because I had to throw out question number 3. Question number 3, if you had factored out the 5, you would get 5 times parentheses x minus a box, and I like to do the side problem. 5 times the box equals 4. So if you divide by 5 on both sides, you get the boxes equal to 4/5. That means your C value is 4/5, and your B value is 5. Now, if you make the period of cosine is 2 pi over b, that means my period is 2/5. And the reason why I threw out this question, so you should not have question number 3 graded, is because I need a shift of 4/5 to the right, so that would be this one. But if your b value, it should have had 2 pi over b, which is none of these. So what I decided to do was throw out the question. And so C was not graded. So essentially, if you have the B version, yours is out of 93. And what I did is that I said it was out of 100, so I just made it proportional, and then, yeah, Aries does that for you, actually. So version B is still out of 100. Question number 4. Find the value of cosine arc sine 1/2. In this problem, what you need to do is set the parentheses equal to a variable, theta. Theta equals arc cosine 1/2. Remember, the word arc is to mean switch, so we're going to switch these two. The question is, where is sine of an angle equal to 1/2? Well, sine is positive in quadrants 1 and 2. It's easiest if you just work in quadrant 1. Remember, sine, so you could use your unit circle, or you can also draw it out as a triangle, which is really helpful as well. Sine is y over r, so your y value is 1, and your r value is 2. If you use the Pythagorean theorem, so the first thing I did was find the inverse. That's what it says right there, inverse. The second thing is you're solving for x, y, and r. That is the Pythagorean theorem. So r squared equals x squared plus y squared, and then r value is 2, and your y value is 1, so 1 squared is 1, 2 squared is 4. Subtract 1 from both sides and take the square root. X is equal to plus or minus radical 3. Remember, it's positive because here in quadrant 1, all your x values are positive. And then really in this problem, you're just finding cosine. Cosine of theta. Well, cosine is x over r. And my x over r is radical 3 over 2, so the answer is choice 3. Question number 5 for the Ken. Fill in the blank square so that each row and column contain all the digits 1 to 4. Number in cages may repeat as long as they are not in the same row or column. You got 5 points if you were correct, and then 1 point if you were incorrect. Look for the freebies, and you only have to do it once. Remember, that means division. And if you add up all the points on the front side, that one is out of 35. If you go to the back side, find the exact value. The first thing I did, we did a similar problem, is find the inverse. I'm taking this part here inside the parentheses, and I'm equaling it to a variable. I chose alpha. So alpha equals the inverse of sine of negative 1/2. Remember to switch these. For some reason, students didn't not like the radical. So a common mistake for students is they just wrote like negative 1/2. There is a radical there. Now you could have rationalized it. So my inverse to get 2 points. So what I did for the free response is normally it's out of 4 points. So if you got something correct, like a 2 points, I just made it equivalent to out of 25 proportional, and therefore each is worth 6.25. So 6.25, 2 points, that's 12.5. So to get that second point, you switch them, and basically you would get sine of alpha equals negative 1 over radical 2. Here are some hints. If you take the inverse of sine, remember the restricted domain is between negative pi over 2 and pi over 2, which is essentially, if you look at your unit circle, this here is, remember, going clockwise would be a negative angle, so from quadrant 4 to quadrant 1, that's pi over 2. And then if you find your two values where sine is negative, it's only negative in quadrants 3 and 4, and you'll get an answer of 5 pi over 4 and 7 pi over 4. If you make these equivalent fractions by multiplying by 2 over 2, you'll get negative 2 pi over 4 and 2 pi over 4. None of those match, so if you do coterminal angles and subtract 8 pi over 4, you get negative 3 pi over 4 and negative pi over 4. And this gives you a hint that you're going to be working in quadrant 4. Now, if you didn't know that, you could have worked in these two quadrants if you drew out your triangle. So number 1, find the inverse. Number 2, solve for your x, y, and r. So you're in quadrant 4, and you know that in sine, your y value is 1 and your r value is radical 2. And this negative sign looks confusing, but it's the y value because you're going down on your triangle. So y equals negative 1. Your R value is radical 2. You should recognize that you have a 45, 45, 90. I'll just quickly do the Pythagorean theorem if you couldn't figure that out. So your R value is radical 2. The x value is unknown, and the y value is negative 1. So radical 2 times radical 2 is 2. Negative 1 squared is 1. So if you subtract 1 from both sides, you get 1 equals x squared. Take the square root. You have x equals a plus or minus square root of 1 is 1. So x should be a positive 1 or negative 1. In this case, it's positive because you're going towards the right. And the last piece you need to know is that tangent of alpha is y over x. So your y value is negative 1. Your x value is a positive 1. So you have a negative 1 divided by a positive 1. Your answer is negative 1. Remember, tangent also negative in quadrant 4. What would happen if you actually rationalized it and then did your y over r? You would have a y value of negative radical 2, and then this would be a positive radical 2. So you would have negative radical 2 over positive radical to still give you tangent of negative 1. So you were awarded points. If you just try the problem, normally 1 out of 4, you got 6.25. If you at least got me the inverse equation, sine alpha equals negative 1 over radical 2, I give you 2 points. You got 3 points, or 18.75. If you got tangent alpha equals positive, if you're in the wrong quadrant, or if you didn't use the restriction of the domain. So that question was out of 25 points, which is 1/4 of your test. Question number 9 was to graph the following trig functions over one period. Be sure to include a table of values and label your axes clearly. I also announced that you should have your letters, A, B, C, and D, the period table, just like in the previous quiz, and graph your trig function. You're graded on your x-intercepts, accuracy, table, period, and then the letters. Remember, I just made it proportional, so each point is worth 6.67. Here I have a trig function y equals negative 2 cotangent x plus pi over 2. I want to get the letters. Remember, you see a plus sign, change it to 2 minuses. Therefore, your c value is negative pi over 2, which means we're going to go left pi over 2. Your b value is equal to 1. There's nothing to factor out. There is no d value, so we're not moving it up or down. No vertical shifts. And a equals negative 2. We call that a fake amplitude. And the graph is inverted. The second thing, you're going to find the period. Common mistake for students is to think the period is 2 pi over b. That is only for the other 4 trig functions. Tangent and cotangent, your answer is pi over b, so b value is 1. So your period is going to be pi, which basically means my graph here, if you can see it, finishes its whole graph within pi. How do you make a table? Well, you don't have to put it between, in this problem you do, sorry. Everything to the right of the trig function, if you take the d value away, you're always going to put that between your period, which is 0 and pi. So in this case, if you subtract pi over 2 from both sides, all sides, remember pi is 1 pi, or 1 pi over 1 multiplied by 2 over 2. You get 2 pi over 2 as an equivalent. And then if you subtract 1 pi over 2, 2 minus 1 gives you 1 pi over 2. So my graph's going to start at negative pi over 2 and end at pi over 2. And this box here tells you your starting point and your end point for your 5x values. So my 5x values are going to be negative pi over 2 and 1 pi over 2. And to find your 5 points, you just basically need to do a midpoint. Negative 1 plus 1 gives you 0. 0 divided by 2 is 0. So 0 or 0 pi over 2 is your middle point. And then I can find the midpoint here. What I did was there was something nice, so I doubled it. 0 pi over 4. This becomes 2 pi over 4. And then you can see that this is just a 1 pi over 4. So I'm circling the simplified ones. These are my 5 x-intercepts or x values. Now, what I'm doing essentially, I'm showing you guys the long table, and then I'll show you guys the short table. if you move your d value over here, which we don't have anything, you're just using the order of operations. And in some ways, the order of operations is actually going from right to left. So the first thing we're going to do is to my x values, I'm going to add pi over 2. So if I add pi over 2 here, or I take this circle number, put it in for x, I get negative pi over 2 plus pi over 2, which is 0. Negative pi over 4 plus pi over 2, so this is like 2 pi over 4, that gives you 1 pi over 4. 0 plus pi over 2 is pi over 2. Pi over 4 or plus 2 pi over 4 gives you 3 pi over 4. And pi over 2 plus pi over 2 gives you 2 pi over 2, which is just pi. And then we're going to find the cotangent at these values. So if you have your unit circle, cotangent is x over y. So if I look at negative pi over 2, that would be in this location, right? Because standard position would be here, and then negative pi over 2, and then the order pair here is 0, comma, negative 1. So that means my x value, let's think about this. Cotangent at 0. So that would be 1 x over y, so 1 divided by 0 is undefined. Cotangent at pi over 4, same thing, x over y, radical 2 over radical 2 is 1. Cotangent at pi over 2, 0 divided by 1 is 0. Cotangent at 3 pi over 4, that's x over y, negative radical 2 over positive radical 2 over 2 is a negative 1. And then at cotangent at pi is over here, so that would be negative 1, 0. So that would be negative 1 divided by 0, which is undefined. And then the last thing you're going to do, the last students get confused in this part, is you're multiplying by negative 2. So all these values up here, we're going to multiply by negative 2. Undefined stays. Negative 2 times 0 is 0. Negative 2 times negative 1 is positive 2. And then here are your values. So at negative pi over 2, you have 5 points. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on my graph. The undefineds I put in purple here is our asymptote. At negative pi over 4, you'll have negative 2. Pi over 2 is 0. What happened here? Sorry, 0 pi, or just 0, you have 0. And then at pi over 4, you have 2. Remember, for tangent and cotangent, you have this linear equation, 3 straight points there, makes it nice and easy. And then you have your snake. A short way of doing this table, if you haven't figured it out, it's still getting your 5x values. You just put in the points. So let me just pick one for you, like something like pi over 4. You basically do it in your head, or pi over 4 plus pi over 2, so pi over 4 plus 2 pi over 4 is 3 pi over 4. Cotangent at 3 pi over 4 would be negative 1, and negative 1 times negative 2 is a positive 2. And that's how you get the table, and essentially you're still graphing the same thing. So again, you did get a 0 if you didn't, if you attempted something but nothing was correct, so I didn't give you any credit for an attempt. And then shape is if you understood which trig function, x values or x intercepts. Accuracy, does it look accurate to me? Do you have a table of values? Did you find the period correct? And the letters. That side was out of 65. So 65 out of 35. Again, I threw out that question, so it's out of 93. And then I just made it out of 100 proportionally. So it didn't affect your grade that I threw out that question. And that was version B. Good luck.